Welcome to Vintage Velocity, the podcast from the Vintage Sports Car Club. I'm Laura Plattman, and today I'm here in Suffolk with Peter Stevens at his remarkable farm. Hello.
Hello, indeed. Welcome.
Peter is one of the world's best known and most sought after automotive designers and consultants. And I met you, Peter, first at the Royal College of Art when you were a professor in the automotive design department. And then more recently, I bumped into you at Pendine Sands with the Vintage Hot Rod Association.
Absolutely.
And you were competing in your 1925 Model T Ford, is that right?
It was a 1928 Model A Ford with a 25T body, which was the way they built hot rods, competitive hot rods in the 1930s, because 25 was the last year when Henry Ford only had one door, and that was on the passenger side. So it was lighter and cheaper, and the body is narrower than a Model A, so it could go faster. So it was a kind of proper hot roddy thing from that period.
And for those only listening, Peter and I are sitting behind his new but rebought Alexander Ford. And Peter, can you tell us a little bit about this car? Because I know it's a bit of a mixture as well, and you will be able to explain it. So tell us all about it. For those who are, can you describe it to people who are only listening as well?
Right. Well, if I start the story, which strangely enough is that I was looking for a proper pre-war hot rod in America. And I went to see a friend of mine, Phil Riley. He actually he had a business which restores Miller and other fantastic pre-war race cars. And he had an old guy who'd retired working from him, who'd been a mechanic for Parnelli Jones. And he said, go on, he's got all kinds of stuff, you know. And he had this enormous 4-car garage space, you see. And he had a car which was based on a Model A, and it had Model A engine, but it had a Riley overhead. That's American Riley, not our Riley, you might say. And so we did a kind of deal, you know, that I was going to buy this thing from him, which wasn't expensive. Pre-internet days, so I was seeing some other friends in America. When I got home, there's a letter from him saying, tell you what, I'm not selling you that car. I had a look inside the engine, and it had thrown a rod and someone had done a bad repair. You got to trust me on this. I've got something else, but you've got to finish putting it together. And it's almost unique because it's got an Alexander overhead engine on a B block, you see.
Now, who and what is an Alexander overhead on a B block?
Well, the Alexander bit's great. There was and he was a young man, and he lived out Midwest, and he had noticed the trend for what they called tether cars, which were little diesel engine model cars, and they raced against each other. There was a pole, and it had these kind of bearings, and a bit of wire went out, or the tether, to these cars. So you could have 4 abreast on a banked circular track. You started them up and then just let them go, and they just thrashed around, and you didn't have any control over them. And he made very good cars, but there wasn't much business in the Midwest, and his wife persuaded him that they should go to California. Now, he had strayed because his name was Colonel. That was his first name. People mistakenly think he was obviously a proper colonel, but he was Colonel Alexander, in his 20s. When he got to California, he realized there were full-size cars racing, and he became fascinated. So in about 1932, he developed an overhead valve cylinder head for the Ford Model B block. And he made about 7 of these. And this is the only one that's still racing. The others are all shiny, and they're in museums and things, which is a shame, because things should be used if they were meant to be used. So he was an interesting one. I've got results from some early dry lakes. That's the lakes about 100 miles to the east in California, where there were these huge flat.
Not the Bonneville.
No, Bonneville is further. Bonneville's on salt. This is on talc, which is a kind of unbelievably fine dust. So it's not like sand. And it's an interesting thing because when you see hot rods these days, everybody likes to paint them kind of matte black because they think, well, they painted them in the old days. What happened was when you took an old Ford, shiny black body, out to the dry lakes, within two meetings, this tiny grains of talc got into the paint and turned them satin and eventually matte black. So it's not done with an aerosol. It was just what happened.
Done with nature.
But of course, that also looked like a real sign that you were a proper racer, you know, because when you went back with your old Ford of some sort, everybody could see you'd been out to the dry lakes. At that time, it was very disorganized and people just tore about and they ran into each other sometimes. And it took a while for something called Southern California Timing Association to think we need to get control of this thing, you know, because, and they would then set out a course and they had a early wired system of timing, you know, but they did, you know, good fast runs there. Actually, I've been out there and it's another world. I mean, it's fascinating.
And so you got this car, which you'll try and explain to us what it looks like. You've got three cars.
It's got three Stromberg 97s.
You only use one of them, apparently.
On the dry lakes where it was for top speed, maximum speed, it was run with all three. Now, I mean, the story of the car really is actually the story of the engine. The head is actually cast iron, but it has a complex aluminium casting which covers, because it uses long push rods instead of the side valves. It goes up the same hole with a long push rod, two little rocker arms in the top. And so the bit that covers all of that is aluminium. And it's a complex, I mean, it's not the way you would design something now where a gasket is effectively right angle. It's two gaskets which have to join together, and it's not the way you would now want to make something, which is why it keeps itself gently lubricated on the outside as well as the inside. My excuse being, well, that stops the rest of it rusting. But the engine started out in the Model A, then it went into fundamentally this car, which was called an altered. And an altered was a dimension where you could narrow it to 40 inches wide. So you had to get two people sitting in a 40-inch wide, and that became an altered. If you went to a single-seater, that was a streamliner. So those were the three classes, which is why this is vintage, four-cylinder, modified, which is what altereds became called.
And that's what we've got written on the side of the car for those just listening. We have V4/M modified.
Yeah.
But I didn't see you in this car at Pendine. I saw you in
I was in the previous one. I found this in the early 90s, actually, probably 92 or something, when I was doing a project for MG Rover for a Bonneville car on the Bonneville Salt Flats, quite a different thing. And I found it at that time. And when the pieces came back, it took me about a year because the chassis was there and the axles were there, but the scuttle wasn't there, but I had a picture of how it was. The Model T radiator was there, but I had to, you know, there were some bits which just plain weren't there, as always happens with a project like this. But and then I had two racing hot rods, a single-seater at the same time as this. And suddenly I was very busy with freelance design work. It was a period when I was working on rally cars for Subaru. I did a Le Mans car with
BMW.
Well, I did BMW. At the same time, I did with no conflict of interest, a Toyota. Because
were they racing in the same?
They were, but they were in different categories.
Oh, okay.
And so that was because the Toyota was closed and it was kind of GT sort of car, and the BMW was a prototype.
Well, I want to get onto those cars
in a bit.
In a bit.
So
sure.
that's how I found it, and because I was so busy with that, and nearly a year of not using them at all, and so I advertised them both, and I thought, well, whichever goes first, I'll keep the other.
Oh.
Now what happened, unfortunately, is that two guys in Vintage Sports Car Club bought my single seat racer, and because I was umming and hawing, they simply offered me more than I was asking. And then the other fellow who bought the Alexander did a similar thing. He said, "Well, I really want it and I love it." And so suddenly I had no hot rods.
Oh, but you were busy working at that time, so that was a little gap. But
Yeah.
but then you bought this back.
Well, because then after I bought
You
the
got
one,
more.
I bought one by mistake off eBay, which sounds nice because some of my work had been in America, and my eBay was ebay.com, which connected in America, you see. So I began thinking, well, I'll collect some bits to do another hot rod, you see. And this car came up, no, not this car, the previous one came up on eBay, and nobody had bid on it. And it was like $7,000, you know. And I thought, well, maybe there's something wrong with it. And I messaged the guy, and it was an old fellow. He said, "No, it's fine. It's great. Haven't had any bids."
This is what I want.
Yeah. So
did it cost you more to get it back?
No, because a friend of mine shipped stuff back from America, and it came in a big container, and it arrived at Felixstowe docks, and I went with a friend of mine with a trailer as well. But they leave the container open for a day or so because, particularly coming from America, you can get tarantula spiders, which have been living in, and so they leave it and they spray some stuff into it because the tarantulas will hide in the cars and stuff, you see. And so I went down 2 days after it arrived, got it had petrol in, boom, and it started. So I said, "Hey, forget the trailer. I'm just going to, because it's not very far from here, I'm just going to drive it home." You know?
Amazing.
Yeah, so that was a nice one. And it was actually quite fast. It was, I think the best it did at Pendine was 82 miles an hour, which for a flathead,
But what was nice about it is the smile on your face for the weekend was just constant.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, everybody's smile on their faces at Pendine is constant. It's such an extraordinary event.
It is. I mean, it is. I mean, it isn't the beach where people like Malcolm Campbell, because the tide comes in and swishes it out, but it's the same, so it's never the same beach on the second day, but effectively it's the same place, and there is a great historic feeling. Pendine's a funny little village. Quite a few of the people in Pendine love the fact because it suddenly brings money to the village.
Yeah.
Some people absolutely hate it and they close their shops. There's a fish and chip shop and a supermarket. "Oh, we don't want all those people coming down here. I'm not going to do it."
I had wondered why that fish and chip shop would close. And
Yes,
you had to go to the only other fish and shop, which was really good.
I know.
But it's such an extraordinary event.
It's just bizarre that some people a terrible intrusion,
So, going with,
Yeah.
I want to know about your fascination with these hot rods and your involvement with the Vintage Sports Car Club, and the Hot Rod Association as well. But what's your involvement with the Vintage Sports Car Club and the hot rods? Have you raced? Have you competed up the hill at Prescott? What have you been doing with?
Yes, I have, and particularly the sprint at Kerbera with the single seat. Although it was T engine, which means it only had 2 speeds, it was just great round there, and I raced this there as well, and I did Prescott with the T. I did Chelsea Walsh, and if you only got 2 speeds, neither of them is any good for Chelsea Walsh. It was just absolutely, it was just the wrong car for the place actually. But
And what class do you race it? Do you compete in?
There are, because at the time, if you didn't have mudguards, fenders, then it was obviously a racing car. You see, even though it nowadays, I drive this on the road, nobody stops and says, "Where's the mudguards?" They're all looking for some poor kid in a lowered VW Polo, with a noisy exhaust. Which when I first, they were looking for, well, they were looking for Jeeps. I had a Ford Jeep, and I got stopped every day on the way to the college. So I always carried the license and insurance with me. So I didn't get a producer, which meant you had to go to the cop shop and show all your paperwork.
But what started this fascination?
Well, I suppose part of it was that I was fortunate, but it wasn't of my choosing. My mother's brother was Dennis Jenkinson, who was known for his car exploits, and he had all these different interests, one of which was Vintage Sports Car Club, one of which was motorcycle sprint racing, one of which was motorcycle sidecar, where twice he was world champion. So he was a wonderful influence actually on all of that. He was also my dad's really best friend. They were both called Dennis, and they would go to Italy in the 356 Porsche, and my father would go off to art galleries, and Dennis would go to like Monza or something, and then they'd go to the opera together in the evening or a jazz club.
I'm just now joining up because you trained at the Central St Martin's and then Royal Automobile Club, Royal College.
Well, I did.
And so I can see now how the two worlds of yours have
Yeah,
collided.
I mean, it's easy for me to say now, oh, well, it's obvious that I was going to be a kind of industrial designer because of the art from my father and the engineering from my uncle. I didn't think that at the time, but it's now a kind of realization which I enjoy.
Yeah, I can see that. So we'll move on and we'll come back to this car because I think it weaves itself throughout, I think.
Yeah.
But I've sort of known you and known of your work with the McLaren F1 road car, the Jaguar Sport XJR-15,
15, yeah.
and the MG GTZ V8 record breaking car. So I'd like to know more about these. Which one came first, and how did you get commissioned to be the consultant with these, and how did you go about that?
Yes, well, I immediately after college, because one of our tutors was Tom Caron from Ogle Design, and Tom asked me, what I was going to do. Well, because I was sponsored actually at RCA very nicely by Ford Motor Company. So I was a student, and at the time, myself and a friend of mine, we were on £1,200 a year, which doesn't sound a lot now. It was enough that Dawson could buy an ex-Betty Haig Porsche Speedster.
That's lit up my brain because I'm all about the women.
Absolutely, and when we went down to look at the car, and because I drove him down and we went to look at the car, and she'd made lardy cake specially for us, which was, we just thought that was funny, but very, very cool actually. So, and I bought a little 750 BR Zagato bodied Abarth, because with that money, it's absurd. You could buy cars like that, and the Abarth cost, neither of them cost as much as £1,000, I would say, So that got us sort of interested in those kind of cars. But the first car I had, I bought an M-Type MG because my friends all had Austin 7s, and the MG had overhead valves, So that was really, because the Austin 7s were not terribly quick actually. They didn't handle, and they certainly didn't stop at all. They had self-defeating brakes, as I always called them. And the MG. So I'd actually joined the Vintage Sports Car Club with the M-Type because I hitchhiked to a hill climb at Prescott quite opportunistically, how I expected to get there and back. But I'd probably got the train to somewhere near, and I was given a lift by these lads in an old Land Rover, and they said, "Oh, what car have you got?" And I said, "Oh, I've got a vintage sort of sports car." And they said at the time, "Oh, Austin Ruby or Morris 8, which were about the two rudest things you could say to somebody because they weren't, acceptable." And I said, "Well, no, it's an M-Type MG actually." And then, of course, suddenly they were like my best mates because they shared an Austin 7. So that was my first. But I didn't do any events then. But I went to nearer ones like the driving tests, and there was the Tour of Suffolk or something, I think. So I'd always liked that kind of car. But while I was at St Martin's School of Art, which was on the edge of Soho, and there was a bookshop, but magazine shop that had magazines from all over the world. And fun enough, it didn't have Rude magazines, but it had a magazine called Hot Rod. And when I looked at these cars inside there, and record breaking, and I was just hooked immediately, with the. I probably kept most of those early hot rods as well, because it was fun and it was a different world, and it actually, because at the time, I don't think anybody really thought about sort of preservation of things. They didn't, certainly nobody would have said patina, because that just meant, you couldn't afford to have it painted or something. So those things hadn't begun then. So when I suddenly saw these wonderful cars, that interested me, and I'd always wanted to go to Bonneville, which eventually I did.
With MG?
With MG, yes.
And what were you doing? What were you designing with them, or what was you working with them?
This was the period when, and this is all kind of interleaves in such a way, really, that with Ogle, it was quite annoying that I would see really good clients not come back because they didn't get what they thought was a really good experience at Ogle, because there was a lot of it was a certain amount of dictatorial, no, this is the way we do things at Ogle, and that's what you should accept, you see. And I thought that the idea of freelance would be that the clients would come back for a second project. And I thought that should be one's objective, or the third project, or something long term. So I left to, set up my own. It was just me, but I worked with a model making friend of mine up in Norfolk, in Dereham, to actually. So I worked, for example, with ERF trucks, and I actually designed trucks for them for 12 more years. I did motor racing stuff with my great mate Richard Lloyd as well, and then I did freelance work with Lotus. So I did the XL with Lotus. Then what happened was Colin Chapman died, and the engineering director, a man called Colin Spooner, he realized that without Colin, the company just ground to a halt. Nobody knew what to do. And he thought that what they should do was just start a new project that people could all be involved with in. So we did the XL, which was the front engined 2+2. So, and that turned into eventually a job at Lotus, because when they were bought by General Motors, they said either he becomes the chief designer and it's a job, or we'll put somebody in. It's like a threat. So a threat to become chief. So I became the chief designer there. It then became
and is that when you worked on the Esprit and the Elan?
It was. The Esprit was done just pre-General Motors arriving. When General Motors arrived, it was culturally so different, A meeting at Lotus would normally be in the corridor, and you'd bump into somebody. Oh, what about this? You'd have a chat, and you'd go and get a coffee from the machine. A meeting at General Motors would be enormously carefully structured, So to them, that was all quite strange. And when it came to the Elan, General Motors thought that they should design the Elan, and Lotus. Mike Kimberley was told that he had to go to Giugiaro, who'd done work for Lotus before. General Motors would make a car, and I could make a car, you see, which was kind of weird. But since I have a bit of a competitive streak, like when it comes to the racing as well, you see, it really fired me up to do something interestingly new and look at it. It sounds strange, but looking at different ways of doing your sketching with the cars, because everybody used magic markers, and those gave you, if you took a magic marker, Cool Grey 3, 5, and 7, then inside view that became a VW Sirocco, which was faceted in the 3 colors, and that was, so I did a thing with pastels and color pencils to do much more kind of voluptuous shapes, and curvaceous, because you can't do curvaceous with magic markers actually at the time. So, and that was quite confrontational with Lotus. And we had a big kind of shootout at Lotus with the 3 cars that these people had sent. And all the directors, and it was like 13 of them, and it was 13-0 that it should be the one that I had done, which was nice. And Tony Rudd, particularly, who was in charge of Lotus engineering, and he was a lovely, I mean, interesting history with people like BRM and all of these things, you know, absolute delightful fellow. And he just said, that's a Lotus, and that's what we're doing. Challenging because it was front-wheel drive, but that was principally because most of Lotus's clients wanted them to develop front-wheel drive with good handling. And so it suited very well that we could demonstrate how good a handling car you could do with front-wheel drive.
So I've got I've got a question which threads through all of the cars you've designed. Is you're designing them, but you're ultimately working with the engineering team, and the who wins the battle, the design or the engineering? I mean, they've got a goal. I mean, I was just thinking with the BMW that you worked on for the 1999 winning Le Mans
car, indeed,
car.
yes.
And their objective was to win, get there fast, safe, get home, win, endurance, don't break down. And your objective, was it anything to do with aesthetics and beauty, or was it just to mold around their engineering?
Well, of course, you see, the reason BMW go to Le Mans then was to sell BMWs. It was, you know, the method that you use to sell BMWs, to my mind, couldn't be just winning, you know. If it had no relationship, I mean, they'd done a car in 98, which was a Williams Grand Prix team. They did the car for them. It was a monstrously ugly looking pig. It was terribly inefficient. It didn't work very well. And the BMW-ness was a sticker at the front of 2 things that looked vaguely like the front of a BMW, you know, peeled off and all that. And it was a disaster. And Karl-Heinz Kaufeld, who was in charge of the motorsport, and he didn't see the car until Le Mans, and nor did Patrick Head. And Patrick never lacks for an expletive, but when he saw the front suspension, he said, by the time the bloody spring knows that the wheel's coming up, it'll be on its way down again. Why is it all those linkages? And so Kaufeld asked me across, and he said, we've got to make a better job of the 99 car. We'd like you to do the designing, but work with them at Williams, you see. And so I met with Patrick Head and we talked about it. And he said, well, what are you going to do then? You know, as a stylist, what are you going to do with this thing? I said, well, I'm going to make suggestions. Anything that works as well as what you've done or better in the wind tunnel, will you agree that we can do? If it's worse, we won't do it.
And is this the Williams wind tunnel?
Williams.
Because Williams had a brilliant wind tunnel.
Oh yes, no.
Wasn't it the best wind tunnel?
Oh, and they had a friend of mine, Jason, who became a very good friend of mine, and he made this startling remark. He said, all we can test in the wind tunnel is what we can think of. And we don't think in terms of something looking nice, you know, but, you know, so I think we worked really well together, became really good mates. And Patrick realized, it wasn't, because the first thing he said to me is, this was after McLaren. He said, well, the first thing you need to know is we don't design our own washers at Williams. We just order them, because he thought that McLaren did their own washers, it was that. So Patrick had said to me, well, we won't be very busy then with anything you suggest. I said, well, let's wait and see, So actually, Jason was as keen as I was that we should make something that looked cool and worked really
And was
well.
you able to put your own stamp on it?
Absolutely.
I mean, that...
Totally. I made a quarter scale model with my model making at my little studio I had in Woodbridge at the time that we took over so we could talk with their CAD engineers who did the body surfacing, and they could see how, because we'd made components for the wind tunnel, so we knew, and that was a big scale model, I think it was either third or even half scale. So we knew it did work, which was very nice. And so since when, Patrick and I have still been really good mates, and he phones me up from his yacht in the Mediterranean sometimes, because he does like his boating, his smart boats. So that, I mean, it demonstrated how you really could have a very good relationship with the people, because right after that, and in fact, partly because of the win, probably at Le Mans, I was approached by Nick Stevenson, who was part of the Phoenix people who had just taken over MG Rover, you see, and he said, would you like to come along as design director, to be there? And I asked Calso at BMW, and also another very senior BMW man, what should I do? And they said, work as a consultant. This is how much they can afford to pay you, so that's what you ask for. Expect everything to be gone in 4 years. Just make sure at the end of 4 years they don't owe you anything, And this was Bernd Pitchett's reader who had particularly said this to me. And when I saw him some years afterwards,
he ask if that happened?
I said, well, all except your last one. He said, oh, about owing you money, yeah? Ah, well.
Oh, God.
Yes. But it's funny because the attitude within the cultural attitude within the company was that the enemy was down the corridor, and the enemy was the designers. If you were in engineering, if you were in purchasing, then the enemy was the engineers who were spending your money. So it was a weird culture that I still don't think could ever actually have been broken, you see. So to that extent, it was so different, because when I worked, for example, with Subaru, it was just wonderful working with the engineers.
Now, here at the Subaru, it was with the ProDrive Impreza.
Yep.
Now that's the famous 555, which is, I think, 25 years old. The Colin McRae. It's 25 years anniversary this year.
Yeah.
So what was your involvement with that, and how did you work with ProDrive on that?
Well, it was a period when, because most rally cars prior to that Rally Impreza, a lot of them came from Japanese companies. There is a limit of width on Japanese cars, which kind of defined the limit of what rally cars could be. The FIA then decided to enlarge the width of the cars, I think it was to 1800 millimeters, at which point you could put on wider fenders, wheel arches, you see. And
I'm just visualizing all of the people in France and in Italy on the side of the roads, and the cars just skimming their knees as they're going, and they're waving their flags, and they're skimming
in Portugal,
their
terrifying.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrifying.
Sorry, carry on.
So it meant that we could make the body wider, and so I did I did a lot of sketches for David Richards. I did a full-size tape drawing which shows what the section through it would be at different points, and then we did a full-size clay model, and we did these with my friend up in Dereham in Norfolk. And what was nice is that each car line at Subaru had a father. So the father of Impreza was this older fellow, Fuji-san, and he would come across to look at the car, and he came with just 3 people, and they made all the decisions. They would fly into Amsterdam, and then they got the little plane across to Norwich, which meant they didn't have any queuing at places like Heathrow. I mean, just lovely. And we had such good fun. And I mean, they taught me so much about what could be made and what couldn't be made. You know, again, because they're body engineering man, you know, we would discuss it. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, sure, we can do this. Or we prefer this little radius here and things like it was just wonderful, actually. The body, but the parts on the early ones were made actually by in a very simple forming method, where instead of having two giant 400-ton press tools, you have a rubber bolster which presses onto a very much simpler tool, and then you hand finish them. So they did all the body parts for the Imprezas like that, you know, and they came out quite nicely, you know, and they still, yeah,
They're still fetching a lot of money.
well, more than ever now. Yeah, I know.
And now you carried on working with Subaru. I want to go back to some other cars, but you carried on working with Subaru, and you did the Legacy and the Outback.
I
What
did,
did you do with those?
because what happened with Subaru is that effectively they were paying ProDrive for my work on the rally stuff, but they said, we'd like to make a separate arrangement with you, and because we'd like you to do some work on road car design. So I did. They had somebody who did a funny Subaru, and it had a tiny little grill in the middle and really weird headlights, and which was not. Oh, and they'd done something which was called the Blob Eye, which is the name, and it had these huge, doleful looking, you know, like a sort of very miserable cow or something, headlights in it, and sales halved. The average age, and it's a classic car industry thing, the average age of the buyers went from like 30 to 45. Well, that, you know, in car terms, that's a disaster, actually. You know, it's just not what you want. And so I would give them just 13 months by them to do a facelift, which we did again up in Durham, and it was at the Geneva Motor Show just like a year and a bit after we'd first discussed it. But that was they were very open to all kinds of discussion.
That's a good client, isn't it?
Well, it is.
The returning client that you wanted.
It was, and when I give a lecture talking about things in my career, I always describe them as very reliable client.
Yeah.
Which could be code for they paid the invoice within 2 weeks.
Which is
that's my feeling for reliable.
But going back to something which I think is quite exciting is the Jaguar Sport XJR-15.
Ah, yes.
Now you have a little book. It's a grand book, and I've been flicking through that book, and I just find it so fascinating, all of the elements of that. Now tell us about that car, the history, and how that came about.
Well, see, the 15. It was interesting because I had been doing. I've been doing some aero stuff, not on the Le Mans cars, but on some of the touring cars and things like this. I did the body kit for the Mazda RX-7, which won the Spa 24 Hours. And so I had a very good relationship with Tom. And Tom was talking to me about why didn't I think about a sports car for them? Well, at the time, I was at Lotus, and we weren't even contemplating a new car. We'd done the Elan, you know, and so everything was very quiet there. And I can't just sit around and, you know, do some other color scheme or stickers or seat pattern and stuff like that. And so before I had left Lotus, I started working on what was going to be a car that would give you all the experience of driving a Le Mans winning car, the 1988 XJR-9. What I didn't know was that Tom had jacked up and put horrible headlights on the Le Mans car to make it, and of course it looked terrible. So he said, draw me one. And when I drew it, he said, yes. I said, yeah, and it's absolutely terrible. It's not what you want to do. He said, yeah, I do know that, actually. We've actually tried mocking one up, and it's awful. He said, what do you think it should be? Yeah. And so
he gave you the empty page to...
Yeah, exactly. You know,
because wasn't that car part of the Intercontinental Challenge that supported F1?
It was
the F1 races.
What had happened was that during the process of doing the 15, Tom had suddenly got the job to productionize, develop, and then build the 220 Jaguar. Well, Tom didn't particularly like the 220 because it was very big, and it to him it wasn't a race car for the road at all. It was, and the interior was kind of comfortable, which Tom thought was absurd. So he had to explain to Jaguar what he was doing, and which partly came about from a meeting with John Egan, who was at that point still the chairman but about to leave Jaguar. And he invited Tom and I to what these days you'd call a boutique hotel. It was just a nice little pub hotel in Oxfordshire. And we were going to have dinner and stop over and have breakfast and stuff. And during the course of the meeting, Egan said to Tom, "So what's this sports car you're doing, you see?" And Tom, he looked a bit flustered, and he said, "Oh, well, it's a bit of development, and we're just kind of exploring new materials, and it's just we're looking at this and that, and other ways of using carbon." And Egan said, yes. He said, "And what are you going to call it?" And Tom said, "Well, it'll probably be a TWR 9R or something." And Egan said, "Why not a Jaguar?" To which Tom said, "Well, and Egan said, "No, that's not a question, that's a statement."
And a very successful
And Tom
one.
said, "So we can call it a Jaguar?" He said, "Well, of course you can. We'll set up a company, Jaguar Sport. It'll be a joint company between Jaguar and TWR, and you'll build 50 cars, And so it was kind of one of those things, And Tom said, "Oh my goodness, we're doing." So what he then had to do in order not to embarrass the 220, his right-hand man, Andy Morrison, said, "Well, we could do a race series to go with Grand Prix." And at the time, there would be 2 races, one at Monaco, one at Silverstone, and the final would have been in the morning of Le Mans. But Le Mans wanted a fortune.
Oh.
Absolute fortune. And so Tom, he got on reasonably well with Bernie Ecclestone, said, "Well, what can we do?" And Bernie had a deal which was considerably less than that. I mean, it was really very good. And he said, "Well, do it at Spa. That's a spectacular place," which is how the race series came about. And there were only 16 cars because Tom had 16 6-speed race gearboxes left over from the Le Mans program, because when they put the chicanes in to the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans, you needed quite a different gearbox, and you needed a stronger gearbox, and it needed all different ratios. So he had 16, so there were 16 race cars built.
That's a perfect solution. And it was a successful series, and it was a successful car.
Yeah, which so if I'm advertising, the book, I mean, I tried to start the book during the lockdown business with COVID. And in fact, just staying alive, and keeping things working during COVID, there wasn't time then to concentrate. And because I was still doing some freelance stuff online, there wasn't time to concentrate on that, and it wasn't till that was over
you could begin.
That I could begin.
Well, it's published now, and it's a really lovely book.
It is, and it's Porter Press, and Philip Porter, he's got very high standards for these things.
With it.
I mean, it's quite weird. I didn't actually go. I'd read through it numerous times, all the chapters, and then I didn't actually read it until a short while ago. Because I thought, oh dear, it's kind of a bit embarrassing writing a book.
Well, I think you should be proud of it. We have to move on. You have to be proud of it because it's a really beautiful book. Now we have to move on because time is against us.
It is.
And I would like to ask you a few questions. Mm-hmm. So I've asked previously about how you work closely with engineer. So we've sort of done that. But consulting with so many different car companies, do you think you have a particular language? I was thinking when you were drawing with your Pantone pens, and do companies come to you because of your language and your signature, or the way that you work? How did that happen?
I think it's the way that I work, actually. because, and I mean, there's no point trying to compete with those famous guys like Giugiaro and all those other people, because they had that kind of authority, which meant that if you want to work with me, then you'll have what I give you. I've always thought that actually, particularly a freelance designer's job, is to understand as much as he can about the company, understand the culture of the company, and turn that culture into three-dimensional object. In other words, not update the previous car, but go with something quite different, but that really respects that culture that makes the company what it is.
Understand
So
their objective.
yeah, and I think that is a different approach, and I let people know that that's what happens. And I mean, I listen a lot to them. To a degree, I probably then pretend to agree with them and then go off and do what I think they really need
And prove it to them.
and prove it to them, and then they're perfectly happy with it. Yeah, so it's so I think that is different, because I mean, recently I've done a number of funicular railway. The cars. The funicular railway is the one that goes up a steep mountain, and what the Swiss charmingly call a rope pulls it.
Mm-hmm.
The rope is actually like a 50 mil diameter, multi-strand, multi-cord, contra-wound cable, which is, I mean, it's quite, all of the engineering is, I love all the engineering that goes with that, and there I've really been very conscious that in a way I'm imposing something on a historic place, and the fastest they go is about 15 miles an hour. So there's no point it looking like a TGV, because that's just plain absurd, and it gives the wrong message in every sense. So that's understanding the local culture of how they feel about their funicular, and introducing the fact really that it doesn't cost any more to do something really nice. It's kind of caravan tech, and some of them just are awful. And it doesn't need to be, and it doesn't need to cost.
It doesn't cost a lot to be beautiful.
Yeah, and it's so, that's part of what that.
And the future, I mean, you're a consummate educator. I met you as a professor at the Royal College of
Yeah.
Art, and you've travelled the world, Europe and the world, teaching. So the future of design is safe, I think,
Well,
because you're there to teach everybody.
You see, the terrible irony is the first students that I taught, I just went as a lecturer at Royal College of Art, and I went as a lecturer also down at Swansea in the School of Art there. And most of those RCA people I first taught, unfortunately, have either died or retired. So to an extent, I mean, I went on until only a few years ago. So there are still people, I like to think, coming along who will have gained something, because I kind of like to stir things. I like to ask questions that often people don't ask themselves, in case either they don't have an answer or it's one that they wouldn't like, which is, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Which is what I said with BMW. Yes, you're trying to win, but you're actually trying to sell BMWs.
You need to know the objective. Okay,
Yeah,
it comes back to that.
and asking, going and saying, well, what do you actually want to achieve? Is always, well, that's either unpopular or let's pause for thought and discussion, and that's great. And I still like doing that.
And let's go back to the Vintage Sports Car Club. It's got such a great new generation coming through, who are all fettling with their cars. Your passion for racing and engineering with the vintage cars. What advice do you have for the new generation coming through?
Well, I mean, the great thing, and I would tend to say it about, and I'm not being unfair when I say it, Motorsport magazine, and I thought the Vintage Sports Car Club is going to be like Motorsport magazine. Eventually, all the readers or the drivers will be dead, and and it'll be all incapable of driving their cars or reading, So, and that did worry me a lot, and with friends of mine, we have talked about that, I mean, the great thing is that there's probably a missing generation in a way, but there are people in their 20s and 30s now who treat it quite differently, and they have enormous fun with it, like with the camping that goes on at Prescott, or the groups of people who went last year to Montlhéry. You know, I won't mention names, but I mean, wacky, way out young people, and it was such good, and that is so encouraging. I think it's really good, and I think the Vintage Sports Car Club, it's been wise enough to allow itself to be molded a bit to, you know, there aren't kind of thought police, you know, no, you're not old enough and you're not boring enough, you know, so you can't join. You know, it's definitely not that. And I think that's a huge success, actually. And I like that a lot. I like when you go to a meeting, you know, and I mean, there's some bloody quick drivers. Yeah, it's quite interesting who, I mean, they would be quick in anything,
Yeah.
you know, and it's,
I mean, I think when you go to Goodwood and you have these professional drivers coming and
Yeah.
racing in these vintage cars,
yeah,
they have to work hard, you know, and they are fast, but they've got the mentality and they've got the brain, the acumen to just get around the track, but they're having to work a lot harder because of the.
they have to unlearn all those bad habits that come from cars which look after you so easily and nicely. And I mean, the way that race cars are, not anybody, but a huge group of people can be quite fast in them. But to be properly fast, I mean, I ran 956 and 962 Porsches with Richard Lloyd, you know, and we would say, you know, and he would say it of himself, if it's wet, you know, I'm as good as all the others. He said, you know, but there are people who are just quicker, you know, in every sense, you know, and that's whether those people choose to drive in the Vintage Sports Car Club or GT or Le Mans or anything else, you know, I think.
Do you think if you fettle your own car, you obviously know about it more, but do you think you can get faster speeds?
No, I think too much fettling can actually make you disinclined to be quite as ferocious with the throttle as you might be if somebody else does it for you. Oh, well, he'll fix it if it doesn't work. You know, if you know, I do a tiny bit because I go and do this beach race in Denmark at a beach called Remo, you know, and it's just one day. You can have, if you really go for, you can have 14 races, you know. If you're like me, you want to make sure you win more than you lose. It's side by side drag racing on a fantastic beach, you know, and but I do think, well, I've got the trailer, so if something really, but I do think, I think maybe 10's enough, actually, you know. I think, yeah, if you've got a fettler with a huge workshop and transport a truck there,
Yeah.
you just think, well, you know, give it a go. And yes.
So tell me, what do you have in your garage at the moment?
Well, I like blue collar stuff, you know. I mean, outside the garage, I've got something I did early, which is the Legacy Outback, you know, which has got that fabulous flat six engine that was a joint venture with Porsche, and it's just the most spectacular engine, you know. But again, it's now a 22-year-old car.
That's a modern classic.
You know, exactly. Yeah. You know, if something went wrong with it, I thought these were supposed to, you know, hold up. Yeah, what's going on? So in that blue color, there's well, I've got a Citroen 2CV van, the little AZU, which is the one with no rear overhang and the wheels right. And I love it, and it always starts, you know, and it goes down to the village or it goes across to the coast and things like that. You know, and that, I mean, I wrote a recent piece in Instagram and Facebook, whatever happened to honest cars, you know, because I've also got a little Fiat 500, not the big modern hulking one, but the proper little...
Which I believe was in the original photograph for the promotion for that.
It was what was called the 500R, because when they introduced the boxy little 126, they had lots of 500 bodies left, and they put 126 engines in them to make a 500R.
So does the boot close or open? Is it like in a bath?
Well, no,
opening?
That's a little thing you can buy in Italy, which just props it open a tiny bit, because naturally, not being able to leave well alone, the 500R and the little 126 engine, it came with the world's smallest, and I'm doing a little 15mm hole through my finger there, carburetor, so that it wasn't faster than a 126, because it was a lot lighter and actually more aerodynamic in its simple way. And so if you put a 23mm carburetor on it, it's a little hot rod, you see. But that was the one that was part of the program to sell these 500Rs. And what Fiat would always do is lower the suspension on all the cars in their brochures. So they all looked a bit funky. And in this case, they put the wheels from 126, which were a bit wider. So, and it's the one that's in the photographs. So also when they introduced the new 500 in the dealerships, they were given a giant wall photograph of this very car. I bought this car actually when I went to Monaco to launch the McLaren F1. And I thought, well, you know, a friend of mine had said to me, it's the car, you know, a journalist friend of mine that was in all the ads. And it's terribly cheap, and it's only done 20,000 kilometers, you know. And I thought, well, that would be quite cool. I can drive to Monaco for the launch of the F1 in the other end of the scale. And we did some pictures with the 500 and the F1 at the same time. So there's a Model A Ford Roadster pickup. I love that because it's the car that was used for exploration in the Egyptian desert in the 1930s, because the British were kind of wary of the fact that Germany was annexing some places south of the Sahara, and some army officers who were based in India, they bought roadster pickups in India, drove them across to Egypt, and then explored the unknown areas in the Western Desert to find routes that went round behind Libya, because they thought that their oil fields and things further east would be at danger from an alliance that might be between Italians and Germans. So they did all this exploration, and they used two-wheel drive Model T Roadster pickups, and they were the ones who perfected the art of desert driving. They also perfected a modular storage system for all their food and things in boxes, which all fitted in the rear bed.
And I was looking at that earlier, and we've got two straw bales in there, and you said it fits perfectly, the straw bales. So it's what you can carry.
And so a straw bale in America was the same type as a straw bale here. It was what one man could pick up easily and put into a truck, and it exactly fits.
And so for your design mind, that's I
thought, well, that's
perfect.
Very clever. Yeah, so that was cool. So there's that as well. I mean, there's a little Ford KA streetcar, which a friend of mine, David Wilkie, did when he was working at Gear, and it was a little two-seat open version of the Ford KA, 100 horsepower, weighs like 850 kilos, fabulous steering. Handling is brilliantly good. So that's another kind of modest one, if you like. So that's what I like. Yeah.
You've got a little collection here. It's wonderful, and I could talk to you for a lot longer, especially about Egypt and about all these.
The exploration thing of Egypt. The exploration came about because my godfather, he flew Blenheims to resupply the thing called the Long Range Desert Group. The Long Range Desert Group was founded by these army officers who previously had gone exploring in the Model A's.
In the Model A's.
And so there was a link there, because my godfather, they were based in this airfield, the Citadel, just outside Cairo, and they would fly out to an agreed location and actually land in, they marked out a kind of runway with old petrol tins, you know, and so they would resupply them like that. So that's why I later, just a few years ago, I went to do some exploration trips, actually looking mostly at ancient rock art, like 15,000-year-old rock art, because that's another fascination, another diversion I have. But at the same time, I wanted to look for signs of the LRDG having been there. And one of the things we found was a long-range desert group Ford 3-tonner, which had been shot up by an Italian aircraft. And so they'd abandoned it, and it's sitting there still. I mean, unbelievable. I also found the names carved by some of the people from the LRDG who didn't say they would say BEF, British Expeditionary Force, so it didn't give away what they were actually doing there. And there are the names of some of the guys. You know, so all of that bit of history in Egypt.
It's absolutely
We learned,
fascinating.
yeah.
And that's, I think,
That's another evening.
another story. My
Well, it
goodness
is.
me.
It is.
Peter, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great. And the nice bit is we're going down to the village of Debenham and we're going to have some lunch at the Bull.
Can I get to choose a car that we're going to go in?
Well, you probably can, yeah.
But it obviously can't be the Fiat, 'cause that doesn't do anything, does it?
No.
No.
But the deux Chevaux's nice because
going
it
the
likes the
Deux Chevaux.
country roads.
We're going the Deux Chevaux. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on this episode. And do please look back at the other episodes that we've made, because they're all as fascinating and has got such interesting stories as well. But thank you so much, Peter. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure. Yeah, good. Okay.